In one unguarded moment, our connection deepened into something unforeseen, leaving a mark neither of us could erase. The sun blazed its light, shimmering over the pool's surface, creating a quiet, captivating brilliance. I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth that spread through me, filling the rare, tranquil silence that enveloped the backyard. With my partner away on a business trip, the emptiness of the house felt liberating, a solitude I hadn't realized I craved until that very moment. Just as I was getting comfortable, savoring the solitude, I heard the unmistakable sound of the gate creaking open. I squinted, shielding my eyes from the sun, and there he was, my nephew, Ethan, standing at the edge of the pool. A playful grin plastered across his face. "Aunt, hope I'm not interrupting," he said, already slipping out of his sandals and pulling his t-shirt over his head, revealing the athletic build he'd grown into. It hit me then that Ethan was no longer the kid who used to visit every summer. He had grown up. And it felt strange to see him now, a confident young man standing there with that mischievous smile I remembered so well. "Didn't expect you back so soon. Weren't you supposed to be out with friends?" I asked, a bit surprised. He shrugged, grinning. "Yeah, I was, but things didn't work out as planned. Figured I'd come back and hang out here. Hope you don't mind." Before I could answer, he dove into the water with a graceful splash. I watched as he surfaced nearby, shaking his head to clear his wet hair, a wide smile stretching across his face. Man, I forgot how good it feels to swim here. Ethan had spent countless summers at our house growing up, but this summer felt different. He was older now, carrying an air of maturity I hadn't seen before. There was something in the way he held himself, the way he spoke. He had changed, and it was both intriguing and slightly disconcerting. "Glad to see the pool hasn't lost its charm," I said, trying to keep things light. "You know, it's usually just me out here these days. Kind of nice to have someone to swim with." He nodded, floating beside me, his eyes reflecting the bright afternoon sunlight. "I always loved it here, Aunt. It's the only place I can really relax." We swam in silence for a while, the water cool and refreshing in contrast to the heat that surrounded us. But the silence wasn't empty. It was charged with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. We drifted near each other, sometimes bumping shoulders in the pool's natural currents. It was comforting, but also so strange, like we were rediscovering our bond in a way we hadn't before. So, I started breaking the silence. "How's life been treating you? Last I checked, you were running around with that sports team of yours and talking about college. Must be keeping you busy." He laughed, a deep, rich sound that caught me off guard. "Yeah, it's been a whirlwind, training, studies, trying to figure out what I want to do with my life. It feels like there's always something new to worry about." I nodded. "Tell me about it. Seems like yesterday you were a kid splashing around in this pool, and now you're dealing with grown-up stuff. Time flies." Ethan leaned back against the edge, his arm brushing lightly against mine as he looked over at me. "You make it sound like I'm all grown up, Aunt. Still feels like I'm figuring things out half the time." There was a pause. And in that moment, I caught something in his gaze, a look that was more than just the casual warmth we usually shared. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But it made my pulse quicken just the tiniest bit. "Well, I've been through enough to know that figuring things out never really ends," I replied with a grin, trying to shake off the feeling. "Doesn't matter how old you get. Life has a funny way of keeping you on your toes." He smiled, but there was something almost thoughtful in his expression as he watched me. "You're probably right. But at least I have you around to keep me grounded." His words were soft, sincere, and the way he said them caught me off guard. "Hey, that's what aunts are for," I replied, aiming to lighten the mood. "But don't go relying on me too much. You'll have to start making your own mistakes sooner or later." Ethan chuckled, rolling his eyes. "Oh, trust me. I'm making plenty of those already." He leaned in, his arm brushing mine again, a casual gesture that somehow felt different. I could feel the warmth radiating from him. The closeness of our shoulders as we sat side by side in the cool water. "Like what?" I asked, hoping to steer the conversation somewhere less ambiguous. "Well," he began, pausing as though choosing his words carefully. "There's stuff." He glanced over at me with a faint smile, a look that was both playful and earnest, making it hard to tell if he was joking or confiding. "Oh, come on, don't go all mysterious on me now," I teased, nudging his shoulder lightly. "You know I'm here if you need advice on anything." For a moment, he hesitated, then his expression softened. "I know, Aunt, and I appreciate that more than you realize." There was an intensity to his gaze that caught me off guard. It was as if he wanted to say something more, something he wasn't quite ready to voice. The air between us grew heavier, and I found myself uncomfortably aware of our proximity. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the moment faded, and he gave me a casual grin. "Anyway," he said, breaking the tension, "I'm just glad to be here. Feels like old times." "Yeah," I replied, my voice a bit quieter than I intended. "Feels like old times." We floated in silence, letting the conversation drift away, and I found myself lost in thought. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't saying, something simmering beneath the surface. It was unlike him to be so guarded, and for reasons I couldn't explain. It left me feeling unsettled. Ethan swam to the other end of the pool, his form cutting smoothly through the water. I watched him for a moment, marveling at how much he'd grown. How much he'd changed. The playful kid I used to know was still there, but there was a depth to him now, a maturity I hadn't noticed before. When he returned, he leaned back against the wall beside me, the afternoon sun glinting off the droplets of water on his skin. He turned to me with a smile, a look that held an openness, a vulnerability that I hadn't seen in him before. "Aunt," he began, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "I really missed this." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that was hard to ignore. There was a sincerity in his tone, a warmth that made my chest tighten. "Me too, Ethan," I replied, matching his tone. "It's been too long." We sat there in silence, a comfortable, almost soothing quiet settling between us. The sunlight began to dip lower, casting a soft amber glow over the pool, and for a moment, I forgot about everything else. It was just the two of us, caught in a moment that felt timeless. But as the sun began to sink, casting longer shadows over the water, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation hanging in the air, like we were on the edge of something I couldn't quite define. The next morning, I found myself standing at the kitchen counter, my mind still replaying fragments of the day before. There was something about Ethan's visit that lingered, an aftertaste of a connection that was both familiar and unfamiliar. It was hard to explain, even to myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Ethan walked in, his hair damp from a shower, a casual grin on his face as he grabbed a glass of water. "Morning, Aunt," he said, his voice soft and warm. He looked more relaxed than he had yesterday, and I noticed he'd taken his time getting ready, his movements slower, more comfortable. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone casual as I set down my coffee. "Sleep well?" "Yeah, I did," he said, pausing to look at me. "Something about this place just makes me feel at ease." I smiled, nodding in agreement. "It's good to have a break sometimes." He looked at me with a thoughtful expression, as if he was considering my words, but instead of responding, he just nodded, letting the silence hang in the air. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, rather, it felt charged, like there was something left unsaid between us. Without another word, he grabbed a towel and made his way toward the pool. I watched him go, feeling a strange pull to follow him. It was as if a part of me wanted to pick up where we had left off yesterday. To see if there was something more behind the tension that had simmered between us. I wandered out to the pool a few minutes later, my coffee in hand, trying to keep things light. But as soon as I stepped outside, I saw him floating in the water, eyes closed, his body relaxed as he drifted aimlessly. I hesitated for a moment, then sat down at the pool's edge, dangling my feet in the water. Ethan opened his eyes, looking over at me with a lazy grin. Couldn't resist joining me again, huh? I chuckled, splashing a little water in his direction. Someone's got to make sure you don't drown. He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. I'm pretty sure I can manage, but thanks for looking out for me. He drifted closer, the water rippling around him as he neared me. His eyes searched mine, and there was something in his gaze that made my heart race just a little faster. I mean, someone's got to keep an eye on you. I replied, attempting to keep my tone light, though the words felt heavier than I intended. For a moment, he just looked at me, the sunlight glinting off the water as his expression softened. You've always been there for me, haven't you? He said, his voice quieter than before. Even when things weren't easy. I was taken aback by the sincerity in his voice. Well, yeah. That's what family's for, I replied, feeling a bit self-conscious under his intense gaze. He nodded, still watching me. A look of gratitude mingling with something else, something I couldn't quite place. I appreciate it, Aunt. More than you know. The words hung between us, filled with a weight that seemed to deepen with each passing second. Before I could respond, he reached out his hand, brushing against mine in a way that felt both casual and deliberate. It was a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through me, and I found myself looking down at our hands, his fingers lingering against mine. I quickly pulled my hand away, clearing my throat in an attempt to break the tension. Well, anyway, you know you're always welcome here. This is your home too, I said, trying to sound composed. Ethan smiled. But there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. Thanks, Aunt. It means a lot. We sat there in silence. The air thick with an unspoken energy that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. It was as if we were both on the edge of something, but neither of us knew how to take that next step. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. I think I'm going to head out for a bit, he said, getting out of the pool and grabbing a towel. Just need to clear my head. I nodded, trying to ignore the odd pang I felt as he walked away. Sure, take your time. I'll be here if you need me. He flashed me a quick smile before disappearing through the gate, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I couldn't help but wonder what had changed between us. There was a familiarity, yes, but also a strange new distance, a shift that left me feeling off balance. The day wore on, and as evening fell, I heard the front door open. In walked Ethan. He looked thoughtful, almost pensive, as he set his keys on the counter and made his way into the living room. I joined him a few minutes later, sensing that he needed to talk. We sat in the quiet for a moment before he finally spoke, his voice soft and uncertain. Aunt, can I ask you something? Of course, I replied, feeling a sudden tension settle over us. He looked at me, his expression serious. Do you ever feel like you're missing something? Like there's something in your life that's just not quite there? The question caught me off guard, and I took a moment to consider my answer. Yeah, sometimes. I think everyone feels that way at some point. It's part of figuring out who you are, I suppose. He nodded, his gaze shifting to the floor. I don't know. Lately, I feel like I'm chasing something, but I don't even know what it is. It's confusing. There was a vulnerability in his voice that made my heart ache. I wanted to reassure him. To tell him that he'd figure it out eventually, but I knew that wouldn't make his confusion go away. Instead, I placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, hoping that my presence alone would be enough. "Whatever it is, you'll find it," I said quietly. "Sometimes it just takes a little time." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with gratitude, and for a moment, I felt the weight of something unspoken between us. There was a closeness, a connection, that felt deeper than family, and I couldn't deny that it stirred something inside me. As the night wore on, we talked about everything and nothing, our conversation flowing easily, like we were rediscovering each other after years of distance. But beneath the surface, I could feel a tension building, a spark that neither of us seemed willing to ignite. Eventually, Ethan yawned, stretching his arms as he leaned back against the couch. "Guess it's time to call it a night," he said, giving me a sleepy smile. I nodded, feeling a strange reluctance to let the evening end. "Yeah, I suppose so." He stood up, pausing for a moment as he looked down at me. "Thanks, Aunt, for everything. It means a lot to me." I looked up at him, a soft smile on my face. "Anytime, Ethan. You know that." He lingered for a moment longer, his gaze holding mine before he finally turned and headed toward his room. As he walked away, I felt a pang of something, a longing, perhaps. Or a sense of unfinished business. I stayed on the couch, staring at the empty doorway long after he'd gone. There was something about the day, about our conversation, that had left me feeling both comforted and unsettled. It was as if we were on the brink of something, but neither of us knew how to take that next step. When I finally went to bed, my mind was still racing, replaying moments from the day, searching for answers to questions I couldn't quite put into words. I lay awake for hours, torn between the familiarity of our bond and the strange new intensity that had begun to creep into our interactions. As I drifted off to sleep, one thought lingered. Whatever was happening between us wasn't over, and I had a feeling it was only going to get more complicated from here. The days that followed seemed to drift by slowly, each one pulling us further into an unspoken. As Ethan and I spent more time together, I noticed a change I couldn't quite explain. Each moment between us grew more meaningful, and I found myself wondering what had shifted. I told myself it was just him maturing, that I was simply getting to know him as an adult, but deep down, I knew there was more to it. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Ethan suggested we take a walk. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass with a hint of the ocean in the distance. We walked in silence, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts until he finally spoke. "Aunt, I keep thinking about what you said the other day," he said softly, his voice full of quiet intensity. "About finding something that feels right, something that fills whatever is missing." I nodded, sensing he was about to share something important. "I think I'm closer to figuring it out," he continued, his gaze steady. "I think I know what I want." There was a vulnerability in his eyes that caught me off guard. It was as if he were waiting for some kind of confirmation, some assurance that his feelings were real. My heart raced, caught between curiosity and uncertainty. "I don't want to complicate things, Ethan," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "We have a good bond, one that means a lot to me." He stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression filled with something I couldn't quite name. "That's just it," he said. "It's not simple. Is it? It feels different, and I don't know what to do with that." I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Maybe we're both just feeling a little lost," I replied. Though even as I spoke, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. He looked at me, his gaze unwavering. "Aunt, have you ever wanted something that felt just out of reach?" he asked. Like it was almost too close to see clearly. His words hung in the air, and I found myself caught between the urge to dismiss the connection growing between us and the undeniable pull that had been building since he came back. I didn't know how to answer him. All I knew was that, in that moment, standing under the soft glow of the streetlights, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. "Ethan," I began, my voice faltering. "I don't know where this is going. I don't know if it's just in our heads." He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "Maybe it is, but I can't pretend it's not there." Before I could respond, he reached out, brushing his hand lightly against my arm. I felt a shiver run through me. I knew I should pull away, create some distance, but I couldn't. I stood frozen in place, unable to break the moment. "I've missed this," he murmured, his fingers trailing gently along my arm. "Being close to you, it feels right." The words hit me like a wave, and before I knew it, I had closed the distance between us. Our faces were mere inches apart, and I could feel the warmth of his breath. The tension between us rose with every passing second. His eyes met mine, filled with an intensity that made my heart race. "I don't want to run from this," he said softly. "Not anymore." My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away, but my body didn't listen. Slowly, tentatively, I leaned in, our lips brushing in the softest, most fleeting kiss. It was gentle, almost hesitant, as though testing whether the connection was real. The kiss felt natural, like an answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking. And as our lips met, a sense of calm washed over me. It felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. When we finally pulled back, we stood there, our faces inches apart. We were both catching our breath. Ethan looked at me, his expression a mix of surprise and relief. "I didn't think. I wasn't sure." He stammered. I smiled, feeling warmth spread through me. "Neither did I. But I think we both know this has been there for a while." We stood in silence, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. There was a new understanding between us, one that transcended words. It was both exhilarating and terrifying to realize we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. After a moment, he reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gentle, comforting grip. We didn't need to say anything. The silence was enough, a shared acknowledgement of the shift between us. We eventually made our way back to the house, each step filled with a quiet intensity. The newfound closeness felt both familiar and entirely new. It was as though the world had shifted, and we were now part of a story we couldn't predict. As we walked into the dimly lit hallway, he turned to me, a soft smile on his face. "Aunt, I don't know what happens next. But I don't want this to be the end." I brushed my hand gently along his cheek, my heart pounding in my chest. "Neither do I, Ethan. But we have to be careful as we figure out where we're headed." He nodded, his gaze filled with determination. "I'm willing to try if you are." For a moment, we simply looked at each other, both feeling the weight of the moment. The beginning of something we couldn't fully understand. In that quiet, I realized that no matter how complicated things became, this connection was something I didn't want to let go of. As we stood there, the distance between us melting away, he leaned in once more, our lips meeting in a soft, lingering kiss. It felt inevitable, as though everything between us had led to this moment. The kiss was filled with a quiet promise, a tentative step into something new, something neither of us could predict. The night stretched on, filled with shared smiles, whispered words, and unspoken hopes. We allowed ourselves to be swept up in the moment, the world outside fading away. As the first light of dawn began to break through the windows, casting a soft glow over the room, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, one step at a time. When I woke up, the events of the previous night still lingered in my mind. I lay there, watching the shadows shift on the ceiling, feeling a mix of calm and uncertainty settle over me. I hadn't planned for any of this, yet here we were, both navigating something that felt like uncharted territory, a space neither of us had anticipated. I heard footsteps approaching. And then Ethan was standing in the doorway with a hesitant smile. He looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in days, though there was still an underlying hint of tension in his eyes. We exchanged a quiet look, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had happened, as if words would somehow dilute the reality of it all. "Morning," he said softly, stepping into the room. His gaze holding mine with an intensity that made my heart race. "Morning," I replied, sitting up, feeling an odd sense of calm wash over me. Despite the complexity of the situation, I felt grounded, as though somehow, things had fallen into place. He crossed the room and sat down beside me, his hand reaching out to cover mine in a gentle gesture that spoke volumes. There was a sense of understanding between us, a shared recognition of the connection we had found. It was as if we both knew this wasn't something to be rushed or labeled, but rather something to be felt, moment by moment. After a while, Ethan leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the window. "It's strange, isn't it?" he murmured, his tone reflective. "How things can change so quickly. It feels like yesterday everything was simple, and now I don't know where this is going." I nodded, understanding his confusion. "I know. It feels unexpected. Like we stepped into something without realizing it." He turned to me, his expression soft but earnest. "But do you regret it?" he asked quietly. His voice barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid of the answer. I looked at him, feeling the weight of his question. There was so much wrapped up in that one word, regret. And as I searched my feelings, I found only a strange sense of peace. "No," I replied softly, my voice steady. "I don't regret it, Ethan. Not any of it." His shoulders relaxed, and he let out a breath he'd been holding, his hand tightening around mine in a reassuring grip. "I don't regret it either. But where do we go from here?" The question hung in the air, a reminder of the uncertainty we faced. There were no clear answers, no road map for what lay ahead. All we knew was that something had shifted between us. Something that had altered our relationship in ways we couldn't ignore. And as much as I wanted to reassure him, to promise that everything would work out, I knew that wasn't something either of us could predict. "We'll take it one day at a time," I said, offering a small smile. "We don't need to rush anything. Just let things be what they are." Ethan seemed to consider this, nodding slowly as he processed my words. "One day at a time," he repeated, as if testing the idea. "I think I can handle that." We sat in comfortable silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. There was something freeing about not having to define what was happening. About allowing ourselves to simply exist in the moment without the pressure of labels or expectations. The rest of the day passed quietly, each of us going about our routines with a new sense of normalcy. It was as if we had silently agreed to let things unfold naturally, without forcing anything. Ethan spent part of the afternoon working on his laptop while I took care of a few things around the house, our paths crossing here and there in a way that felt strangely intimate yet effortless. Later, as evening settled over the house, we found ourselves sitting together on the back porch, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the yard. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with the kind of ease that only comes from understanding and acceptance. "Do you think?" Ethan began, breaking the quiet. His voice was thoughtful. "Do you think things will always be this complicated?" I considered his question, searching for the right words. "I think life has a way of throwing things at us we're not always ready for," I replied. "But I also think that if something feels right, it's worth navigating the complications." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the fading light. "I guess so. I want to make sure I don't lose this. Whatever this is." I reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're both here, Ethan. That's what matters. We don't have to have all the answers right now." He looked at me then, his expression one of quiet determination. "You're right," he said softly. "I'm just glad we're in this together." As night fell, we stayed outside, talking about everything and nothing. Our conversation flowed naturally as we shared bits of ourselves we hadn't before. It was as though this new chapter had opened a door to parts of us we hadn't known existed, allowing us to connect on a deeper level, one that felt both exhilarating and grounding. Eventually, the chill of the evening air prompted us to head back inside. As we settled in for the night, I felt a sense of contentment wash over me. It was strange, but in the midst of all the uncertainty, I felt at peace. It felt like we had found a rhythm, a way of being that felt right. The days that followed were filled with moments like these, quiet conversations, shared laughter, and an unspoken understanding that had come to define our time together. It was as if we had found our own little world, one where we could be ourselves without fear or hesitation. One evening, as we sat together watching a movie, Ethan turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said softly, "I never imagined things would turn out like this." I looked over at him, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Neither did I. But sometimes, life surprises us." He nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "I'm glad it did. It's strange. But it feels like this is where I'm supposed to be." His words resonated with me, and for a moment, I found myself unable to respond, overwhelmed by the quiet certainty in his voice. It was as though he had voiced something I hadn't been able to articulate, a feeling that had been building within me since the beginning. We sat in silence, each of us absorbing the weight of his words, the unspoken promise that lay between us. It was a feeling that went beyond words, a connection that defied explanation. As the night wore on, I found myself filled with a quiet sense of hope, a belief that somehow we would find our way. Our time together eventually began to draw to a close, the days slipping by faster than either of us had anticipated. There was a bittersweetness to it, a recognition that this chapter was coming to an end, even as a new one waited on the horizon. On his last night with us, we sat together on the porch, watching as the stars appeared one by one in the night sky. The air was filled with the quiet sounds of the night, the distant hum of crickets blending with the gentle rustle of the trees. "This has been unexpected," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking any louder would break the spell of the moment. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. "Yeah, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." He looked at me then, his gaze filled with an emotion that was both tender and unwavering. "Neither would I." We sat there side by side, letting the silence speak for us. It was a silence filled with everything we hadn't said, a shared understanding that transcended words. As the night stretched on, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet confidence that no matter what came next, we would carry this with us. When it was finally time for him to leave, we exchanged a quiet embrace, each of us holding on a moment longer than necessary. There was a sadness in the air, but also a sense of hope, a belief that somehow, we would find our way back to each other. As he drove away, I stood in the doorway, watching until his car disappeared into the distance. The house felt emptier without him. But there was a part of me that felt fuller, a part that had been awakened by the time we had shared. I closed the door, a small smile on my face as I turned back into the quiet house. The memories of those days, those quiet moments filled with laughter, conversation, and an unspoken bond, would stay with me. A reminder of the connection we had found and the possibilities that lay ahead.